I'm Philip Drew, Administrator, and this is the Weekend Interview Show. This week, our guest is Kris Millegan, and I found about him on the Internet when I was looking up Antony C. Sutton, and I found a memorial to Mr. Sutton, who died last spring, written by Mr. Millegan, and I got in contact with him. Turns out he was a friend of Antony Sutton, and so hopefully we're going to talk about him and learn kind of his life story and what he wrote about and what's the big deal with Antony Sutton anyway. And then we can talk about Mr. Millegan's got a new book coming out too, so we can get to that. Welcome, Mr. Millegan.
Good day, sir. Nice to be here.
How did you know Antony C. Sutton?
Well, I was doing some research and writing about Skull and Bones, and I had put a story up on the Internet, and he sent me an email, and that is how I met him. And it took me a couple of years talking to him before he'd agree to meet with me. And then we met and we continued on with correspondence.
When did he die? Last spring, right?
Yes, it was, I believe, June 17th of last year, 2002.
Oh, so almost exactly 1 year ago.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you can tell us a little bit about him for people who don't know him, don't know his story, or what's so important about the books he wrote, that kind of thing.
Well, Antony was basically a technology reporter, a journalist and researcher, and he was working at the Stanford at the Hoover Institute. He had a fellowship there, and he was producing a series of books about Western technology and the Soviets. And he uncovered that during this was in the 60s, that in the Vietnam War, a lot of the half-tracks and the ammunitions and other war materials that were being used, that were being supplied to the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong from Russia, were being built in factories that were built in the United States, and some of them even had American engineers there.
So he found that out accidentally?
Well, he found it by comparative studies of the different technology. He had come from a background. He'd been a foundry, a manager in metals, and an overview person on industries. And so he'd been to a lot of these different type of heavy industries that you have to make different armaments. And so he was well familiar with them. And then in doing the studies, he found that the plans were exactly the same as the plans of the machines that we were building here. And he wrote it up, and he did it in 3 different volumes. And the last volume, which was about current events then in the 60s and about the Vietnam War, was very much frowned upon, because at that point in time, Russia was considered a very strong opponent, and they were doing it all by themselves. And he was showing that, no, they weren't doing it all by themselves. Matter of fact, they had no homegrown technology, and all their technology was stuff that they had gotten from the United States. And, I mean, see, during World War II, Russia was not an enemy, it was an ally. And a member of Skull and Bones, Averill Harriman, was the head of Lend-Lease, where we sent over, all kinds of complete factories, and some people talk about plutonium and sending out currency plates also.
Did you say sending plutonium?
Yes. There's a book called Major Hopkins' Diaries.
Major Jordan's Diaries. Right?
Yeah, Major Jordan's Diaries, excuse me, yes, and it talks about that. But Antony, like I said, he found that out, and they wanted him not to publish the book. They wanted him not to publish it, and he had a contract said he could get it published, so he went ahead and published it. And then also he took some of that material and came out with another book called National Suicide, which was a similar type book, an expose of about how the military and industries were arming Russia at the same time. And
was that for the Hoover Institution as well?
No, that was a private one because they really weren't doing anything about the Hoover book. They weren't giving it any promotion or anything like that, and he wanted to get the story out there because he thought, Americans should know that, the American boys were being killed by armaments that were being built in factories that were coming from America. He didn't, he thought people should know that. And so, he spoke at a convention, a Republican convention about it, and he did quite a few other things trying to get people to notice it. And then he started to, it got him kicked out of the Stanford Institute because they didn't want to hear it, and they told him, they says, drop it or we're going to, you aren't going to work in this town ever again, and that type of stuff, and he wouldn't drop it. And so he was out of there, and then so he started doing independent research and started writing his series of book about Wall Street. There was Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, Wall Street and FDR, and Wall Street and Hitler. And he started to see how there were people that were financing, two sides, and he didn't really quite understand it still, but he was kept on researching it. And then somebody sent him in 1983, started sending him some information about Skull and Bones, and sent him a complete list of all the members. And he looked at that and said, gee, this is rather interesting. And these are some of the people he had been researching. And so then he put together a series of booklets, 4 booklets about Skull and Bones, and I got them a little bit printed here, but really wasn't able to get them much printed here, and so he was getting them printed in Australia. And then he had a newsletter also called the Phoenix Newsletter, and some people that were a member of that newsletter ran a mom-and-pop print shop up in Montana, and they said, what do you mean nobody will publish you here? And so they published it, and they put the 4 together into one book, America's Secret Establishment, an Introduction to the Order of Skull and Bones, in 1986. And but they couldn't get any distributors or anything to do anything, so they just proceeded to sell it through the underground and through the only bookstores I ever saw it in was a John Birch Society bookstore, but it wasn't readily available out there, but it still sold quite steadily. And I ran across it in 1988. They came out with it in 86. And I was really happy to come across it because it helped me understand my father and some things that my father had told me. And my father he'd been in OSS and in the CIA, and he'd been in World War II. He'd been also in G2. He'd been sheep-dipped into G2 and put on MacArthur's staff, and he was branch chief head of all of East Asia for research and analysis for the CIA. And then he was covert for a few years, and then finally he was asked to be involved in the drug running, and he wouldn't have anything to do it, and he left and moved the family out to the West Coast and ended up teaching school, and he told me some things one time I didn't understand. He asked me what I thought of the Vietnam War, and he being a teenager, talking to your dad, you know it all anyway, and I says, well, you gotta, and I'd been raised on World War II, all my uncles were in World War II, and John Wayne and all that, and I says, you got a sack of hand grenades, and you got some rice patties, and you go throw the hand grenades and win them for the good guys wearing the white hats, just flip a little answer. And he said we had to have a talk, and he waited a while till this guy, Dr. D.F. Fleming from Vanderbilt was in town, and he took me in a room and sat me down, and he looked at me and he says, the Vietnam War is about drugs. There's these secret societies behind it. You're talking to your dad, and, you pretty much figure out what he's saying, or think you're figuring out what he's saying before he even says it, and I'm saying, okay, so he's talking about the mafia, and then I'm thinking, well, this is an anti-drug, this is my dad's way of having a drug talk about with me, and we all knew what my dad did, but it wasn't like something he talked about, he'd never talked about his work before with me or anything like that, or stuff from his work. And then he said this next thing. He said, right after he said that the Vietnam War was about drugs, there's these secret societies behind it all. He said, and communism was all a sham. These same secret societies behind it. And that just flew me for a loop. I mean, I figured, what's my dad talking about?
Well, and just for someone who's just tuning in, who was your dad again?
My dad was Lloyd Millegan. He was a CIA operative, and he was in OSS and G2, and he got involved in intelligence when he was 18 years old. He was an exchange student to China in 1936 as a sophomore from Linfield College. And he was, like I said, branch chief, head of all of East Asia for research and analysis for the CIA. From the very beginning of them on up, and he wasn't branch chief at the start, but he was branch chief in the 50s. And then, I didn't really understand that he told me, he says, communism's all a sham. It just didn't make any sense to me. I mean, teachers have been stuffing me under desks because the Ruskies were going to bomb us and whatnot. I mean, I don't know, I'm 53, I guess, here, and it just didn't make any sense to me. And they told me some other things, like, that when Eisenhower had come aboard as president, they had he'd asked for some worldwide assessment thing, and my dad had been responsible a lot for the assessment for Southeast Asia, and they said they had told him to work with Ho Chi Minh. We had worked with Ho Chi Minh during World War II, and to not get involved in a land war in Asia. And then they told me that they felt that the Vietnam War, they were following a loose scenario in this assessment report that they'd done for Eisenhower. There'd been all these different, if you do this, we do this, this will happen, and blah, 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 blah. And they felt that they were playing out a loose scenario. And then the last thing they told me, because it was really quite evident that I really wasn't understanding what they were saying, because, I mean, like I said, when he told me the thing about communism was all a sham, that really, I was still trying to figure that thing out at the time when they were talking. And then also in the back of my head, I say, "Oh, this is my dad's way of having a drug talk," and listening to your dad. And they said some stuff about how the news wasn't really the news, and they called it the sway pieces. And because one of the last things my dad had done, he had been involved with the putting together of this. Of the briefing, start of the briefing every morning in D.C., the intelligence services put together kind of a newspaper type thing. Just with they start the day off there a lot with. But so he told me that, and I didn't, I just kind of tucked it in the back of my head, said, because this was the late 60s, I was growing my hair long, I just figured this is my dad's way of having an anti-drug talk, and just, went on with my life. And then later on, I was reading, probably a girl, what do you call them, girly magazines or whatnot. And they were having an article in there about JFK assassination. And one of they were laying out all the different theories, and they just had in there. They said, well, and there's some people that talk about the involvement of a secret society in it. And that brought back the conversation that my dad had about secret societies and whatnot. And so then I started to, I'd been looking at the Kennedy assassination, but then I started looking at the subject of CIA drugs and secret societies, and I couldn't find out a lot of information about it. And then I heard about Mr. Sutton's book, and I got a copy of that in '88, and then just you get books and you look in the bibliography and you keep going on up the stream and whatnot and seeing what there is to this. And I looked into conspiracy theory, and I went to all the different bookstores and looked at all the different kinds of conspiracy theory. And some of them are just kind of formula books where they want you to you can find books that blame it all on these people, on all those people. There's books that blame it all on, all on the Catholics, all on the Jews, all on the hippies, all on the Mormons, all on, whoever they don't want you to like, all on the Masons, and all kinds of stuff like that. And but Sutton's book rang the truest to me, and it just made so much sense. And he talks about the Hegelian dialectic and how when William Huntington Russell came back and started Skull and Bones, or formed a chapter of a organization that was already formed in Germany, and the Hegelian Professor Hegel had just died in chair in 1831, right when Russell was there, and the Hegelian dialectic, where they create the thesis and the antithesis to get to the synthesis, and how they control both the left and the right, and it just it made a lot of sense. And then so I've tried to research it, and the more you get in and research it, of course you get more questions, but the more validation that you find for that is actually how the world really works. And a lot of people say, oh, there's no conspiracy, it's just a system. Well, these guys have been around since 1832 as this particular group, and they spent a lot of time to set up this system. And where we have the Federal Reserve, which isn't a part of it isn't a part of the federal government. I mean, our money is not a part of our government, and why did they go to all these shenanigans, call it the Federal Reserve and all this to make us think it's part of the government, but it's a private bank. I mean, I'm 53. I didn't get a civics class. Most people I know that are my age and younger didn't get a civics class. They don't. They go over it a little bit, but they don't really teach you about what it means to be a member of a republic. I mean, they want us to think we're in a democracy, but we're a member of a republic where our rights come from God. They don't, that piece of paper limits the power of government and whatnot. But the object of this folks of Skull and Bones, and they're basically a cult, and most of the people that are movers and shakers in it are all blood related. Is to turn our country into more of a fascist state, and to move the economic engine out of here and whatnot. And it's what they've been doing for a long time.
So Antony Sutton had written for how long and how many books before he found out about Skull and Bones? My impression, I've read Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler and Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, and he doesn't mention Skull and Bones in there at all. No,
he had written those before then. And he probably had written, I think it was about eight, nine books about before he uncovered Skull and Bones. He's written 20 books in all.
So the point is that, Antony Sutton's dad didn't sit him down and tell him about the Skull and Bones before he got into all this. He got into all this and found out about the Skull and Bones at the end.
Right, because they, basically they touched his life. I mean, they because he uncovered some stuff that they were doing, they, caused his life to be heck, and so he just turned around and wanted to see, what caused it, and kept on following it. And then he was sent a membership list of Skull and Bones, because they are.
That to him?
What?
Do we know who sent that to him? I mean, presumably it was a dissenting bonesman, but maybe not.
Well, it was a relative of a bonesman. It was a relative of a bonesman, and I get calls from relatives of bonesmen quite often, and it's an interesting organization. They don't always take care of everything they should take care of, I think. I mean, they're absolutely outrageous. They're a 501(c)(3) corporation. When the people pay their dues and give them stuff, they get to take it off their taxes. They make sometimes $750,000 a year out of their dollars out of their investments, and they don't have to pay any taxes. And all they do is, have parties and meetings and stuff, and rent their own island for a week and stuff. I mean, it's really outrageous that they get away with that. Almost all other fraternities are not classified as a 501(c) corporation, but these guys are. It's really a travesty, but they have the power to pull it off and to keep it hidden because they own most of the news outlets. I mean, there's a book out by Alexandra Robbins, Secrets of the Tomb, and she does better in her radio interviews, but the book is basically a paean to Skull and Bones and says that they're the Wizard of Oz, and sometimes we need the Wizard of Oz. And
yeah, great. She must be a Democrat.
Well, she was a Yale. She's a member of another secret society there, Scroll and Key, and they put her book in the history section. We finally got Sutton's book into Barnes and Noble. I mean, he died rather suddenly 3 weeks after his book was in print, and then they had her book, Alexandra's book, ready to go out there into and it was the first mainstream book about Skull and Bones. And but the mainstream, I mean, if you look at these guys, the raw power of their Rolodex is just amazing. And so, I mean,
hold on right there for a second. I want to ask you, by the way, real quick here. Is there any suspicion about how he died, or it was just one of those?
Well, there's a little bit of suspicion in that it was sudden. All we can get from the coroner is that it was natural causes. But he was looking for a new place to live. He was all excited about his book coming out in hardback for the first time, and with the opportunity of getting it into Borders and whatnot. And he was ready to come out. He was basically a recluse. He didn't do a lot of interviews, and we was getting him booked on some radio shows and whatnot. And that just stopped it, nipped it in the bud, and his book gets put into the speculative part of the bookstores with UFOs, and Alexander Robbins' book gets put into the history department.
Yeah, of course. But it wasn't like he went canoeing and drowned like old former director of CIA, Colby.
No.
Or a single car accident off a bridge or nothing like that, right?
No. He just died at home in an apartment.
All right. Well, yeah, I didn't want to get too much into that if we don't really know anything about it, but I just wanted to be clear that, he didn't shoot himself in the back of the head with a rifle or something like that.
No, he didn't.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, I was going to ask you maybe we can rehash some of this. What exactly did you find in America's Secret Establishment that put these things together? What prominent bonesman is he pointing at, and what is it that they did that's so bad?
Well, it's not so much the prominent bonesmen. It is their modus operandi, where they first came here, and their first objective was to take over our education system, and they found that through this Prussian education system, where they take the subjects, break them apart into hour-long discussions with bells in between. They sound familiar? They found that they can create a false construct around us. And then by manipulating that false construct, they can then move the debate in the direction that they wish to move it in. These guys were very influential starting in the U.S. Grant, the administration of U.S. Grant. You had Alfonso Taft, who was the Attorney General, and they helped craft the deal which put Rutherford B. Hayes into office, where Rutherford B. Hayes did not win the most votes in the election, but through some shenanigans in Louisiana, North Carolina, and Florida, he won in the Electoral College, and basically a deal where the Democrat, they said, okay, we'll put this guy in, but what you guys have to do is you have to take the troops out of the South. So this was the deal that ended Reconstruction. And Rutherford B. Hayes is a member of a group which is called the Deeks, Delta Kappa Epsilon, which was a junior society started at Yale in 1844. And of the many societies started at Yale, the only one that went farther than the Yale campus and became known as an international secret society And when you add in the members of Deeks, and both President Bush and President Bush Jr. Were both presidents of Deek when they were at Yale also. And when you add those in, you have Rutherford B. Hayes, you have both the Roosevelts, and then you also have Quayle and Gerald Ford.
So that's where the Roosevelts tie into Skull and Bones then?
Well, they tie into there that way, and then also with the opium running. Both the Roosevelt family was heavily involved in opium running. And there was basically a group of families that are all related blood that were around Harvard and around Yale that were heavily involved in opium in the 1830s on up to 1856 when opium became legal in China and they didn't need the smugglers anymore. And the interesting thing there is that
that's funny, when you legalize, the criminals go out of business and have to move on to do something else.
Well, what Skull and Bones did was through Alphonso Taft's son, William Howard Taft, the only man to be President of the United States and a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, he was the first civil governor of the Philippines, and how we got the Philippines is another wild story that involves the Roosevelts and other things. I mean, Roosevelt was under Secretary of Navy, and the Secretary of Navy went home early one day, and Teddy stepped up to the big desk and let off a bunch of orders and all kinds of things, and the Secretary came back the next day and says, "Teddy, what did you do?" And he never went home early again. But because when the Spanish-American War, they got the population all up in arms, and about the battleship Maine and Cuba, and we were going to go to war to save the Cuban people. But as soon as war was declared, we didn't go into Cuba. No, we took the Philippines. It was the first thing we did. And the opium smugglers had always used the Philippines as a base of operations. Matter of fact, they always had companies that would have the same name as theirs, but they'd be based in the Philippines. So when they would, in genteel publications, they would say, "Oh, they didn't have anything to do with opium. Their company had nothing to do with opium." Well, their company that was based out of Boston didn't, but their company that was based out of the Philippines had a heck of a lot to do with it.
And just so you know, I want to interrupt you here just real quick to tell you, Mr. Milligan, we've only got about maybe 10 or maybe at the most 13 more minutes we can push this.
Okay.
Let's
Okay.
really
Well,
haul this through the 20th century here, and I want to talk about your new book too.
Okay. Well, let me just tie this little part in. But so William Howard Taft went back there, and he was civil governor. And if you read anything about William Howard Taft, one thing he wanted to be was on the Supreme Court. He was a jurist all his life. He was a judge, and it got to be a joke. He wore it on his sleeve so much. And, well, he got asked to be on the Supreme Court twice when he was in the Philippines, and he turned them down. And then finally he got asked to be Secretary of War by Teddy Roosevelt, and he said, "Okay, I'll come back and be Secretary of War." Well, if you look at the time in between, he was made Secretary of War, and he got asked to be on the Supreme Court. What did he do there in the Philippines? He made opium illegal for the first time in modern Asia. And then he proceeded to start the Shanghai Convention and the Hague Convention, which then made opium, plants, these 3 plants illegal all around the world, okay, which then allows them to sell these products for 8 times more than what they're worth, okay, and the prohibitions on these plants have nothing to do with our health or our children's health. They have to do with keeping a black market, which allows them then to create amazing amounts of money, which then they have used and destabilize other industries and bought out other industries, and that's how come they basically, control what's going on in this country, is by keeping that black market.
What other bonesmen have been involved in drug running since Taft?
Well, you had the Phelps, you had Bush, you had President George H.W. Bush was running big CIA drug operation right out of the vice president's office. I mean, he was not out of the loop. He was, there's so much testimony to that, there's not funny. And there was, the Roosevelts were involved, the Gilmans were involved. There was an F.T. Bush who was the first consul in in Hong Kong, and whatnot. And the Russells, the guy who started Skull and Bones, W.H. Russell family, was Russell and Company, which was the third largest opium concern in the world, and the largest in the United States. And then you have, they basically set up the national security state here, and they've run a lot of these drugs under the national security aegis. I mean, those are involved are Abel Harriman, Robert Lovett, Henry Stimson. Stimson was also the Governor General of Philippines for a while also.
Interesting. We just learned on this show about Henry Stimson writing in his diary about how we had to let the Japanese get the first strike without causing too much damage to ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, and he takes credit in for dropping the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, talking Truman into it. And we didn't have to do that. It wasn't a military decision. My father was head of the research and analysis for the invasion of Japan, and he told me that a bunch of times. He said we didn't have to drop the bomb at all. It was a decision. And these guys, I mean, look at the Skull and Bones. I mean, that's the symbol of death, right? They believe in the power of death. They like to bring about death. They believe that they get power from that death. But yeah, and I have a book coming out. It's called Fleshing Out Skull and Bones, and that'll be out in September. And also Antony's book, America's Secret Establishment, for the first time is available in Barnes & Noble and Borders bookstores. Go in and ask for it. And if you haven't read any of Antony, I just strongly recommend it. He was very, very good on his research, and I mean, I'm not saying he never gets anything wrong, but he does a very good job of presenting how the world really works, and the best that a person can do is to take his books, look at it, research into it yourself, and you'll be amazed at what you find out there. And when you go looking in literature, and especially conspiracy theory literature, be very aware of what you read, and just because you read it, don't believe it's true. And do research into it, and I just can't recommend Antony's books high enough, though. The Wall Street and
I was going to ask you, maybe we can go ahead and list through the ones at least that you can remember off the top of your head, because I know it's at least 15 books or so, right?
Yeah, well, he has a bunch of books. He did books on gold market, and diamond and platinum for investing and different things like that. And then during the last 10 years of his life, mostly what he was working around was he had a newsletter called Future Technology Intelligence Review, and he was really, like I say, a technology reporter and a journalist, and that's what he was mostly interested in. And it just that these guys caused him trouble, and he wanted to turn around and see what it was, and he was a very diligent, very good researcher, and he shows how, I mean, these guys, financed the Russians, financed the West, financed Hitler. I mean, you have to have a bad guy, because for one thing, when the psychological thing, if you have a bad guy, then you got to have then you're the good guys, right? And I mean, the psychological and the propaganda that we are all exposed to daily is just amazing.
So he wrote Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development in 3 sections, and then the Wall Street Trilogy. What were those again?
Wall Street and FDR, Wall Street and Hitler, and Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. And then he wrote a book called National Suicide. He wrote a book called Best Enemy Money Can Buy. And then he like I said, and then he wrote America's Secret Establishment, an introduction to the Order of Skull and Bones. And he called that his magnum opus, and there's a lot in there about, I mean, how these people took over our education system, and about the Hegelian dialectic, how they create war and revolution, And then, you know, are they a part of the Illuminati? And I personally think they most assuredly are.
Well, he says in the book that the connections are tenuous at best, doesn't he?
Well, they are tenuous, but then as time has gone on, more and more links have come out, and if I mean, there was a big anti-Masonic scare in the 1820s, and after Morgan was killed, and even some of the defenses that the people that were members of Phi Beta Kappa say that directly that Phi Beta Kappa was related to the Illuminati. And most definitely, Phi Beta Kappa, the secrecy of Phi Beta Kappa stopped in 1831. In 1832, William Huntington Russell started Skull and Bones as a secret society to keep the secrets there. Okay, and I mean, and he was still a member of Phi Beta Kappa, but he still started Skull and Bones. I mean, some people will try and say, well, he was mad about the appointments in Phi Beta Kappa, but he was still a member of Phi Beta Kappa. And it was basically the secrecy issue, and the secrecy is a big problem because, you know, who do these people serve? I mean, we have 3 presidents that have been members of Skull and Bones. Okay, and who do they serve? I mean, and we're fed this, like, we're supposed to think that, like, there's George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, and Prescott Bush, and we're supposed to think that Prescott started all this dynasty, and Samuel, Prescott's father, was just some, you know, storekeeper. And he was on the Federal Reserve out of Ohio, you know. And these guys, you know, it's really funny. There's this political philosophy, and it's like deny and take credit and for everything, but then deny everything too. Take credit for what you can, but then deny anything, and just as long as you stand by and deny it. I mean, this whole thing about Hitler and those financing Hitler, I mean, they just came out with a biography on Prescott Bush, a mainstream biography on Prescott Bush, and it continues the same old lie that, oh, well, you know, Prescott, they didn't know, they were just doing it as a favor, and this guy just stashed $3 million in this one bank, and, you know, and he didn't really know about it. Well, that's so much BS. It's not funny. I mean, I got statements in Prescott's own words. It says he was running the Brown Brothers and Harriman. Averill wasn't there. Roland Harriman wasn't there. Prescott was running it. And, you know, and it wasn't just the Union Banking Company. There's Slizen American. There's Hamburg American lines. There was a bunch of lines that were taken, you know, away from these guys in October of 42. And then the funny thing is that they were given back their shares in 51, and Prescott sold it for $1.5 million of the Union Banking Corporation, you know. And it's just incredible the hold that these guys have over the press and everything. I mean, but then you look at it, Time Life, who was that started by?
Henry Luce. Skull
and Bones. Who started Newsweek? Roland Harriman. Skull and Bones, you know. Atlantic Monthly, Skull and Bones, you know. And then Federal Express is Skull and Bones.
The American Historical Association.
Yeah, Skull and Bones, you know, and they started almost all the foundations too, and were presidents of a lot of these foundations at different times.
Oh man, I'm just so sorry, but we are out of time. Everybody, the guy's name is Kris Millegan. He's the author of a new book called Fleshing Out Skull and Bones. You can find it on the internet. It comes out this September. Thanks a lot for coming on today.
Well, my pleasure.
Great.
Okay, take care.
All right, bye.